Shana Tova. Gemar Chatima Tova. In talking to so many people about the challenges of this particular moment, one word inevitably surfaces: disappointment. When COVID first appeared during the spring of 2020, my beloved Zoe's two daughters were seniors in high school. They were so looking forward to the end-of-year parties, the trip to Ashland, school theater productions, prom, and graduation. And what they got was a bucket load of disappointment. Everywhere we looked this past year and a half, so much disappointment. All of our children who spent a year and a quarter struggling with virtual school, separation from loved ones and family, friends, elders, elders isolated from family and friends, holed up in homes or senior living centers. The fact that we could not accompany or visit our loved ones who needed hospital procedures or were giving birth, and for them to endure these things alone. There were so many jobs lost or radically changed, so many loved ones dealing with unexpected loss. There is no such thing as trivial disappointment. When long-awaited simchas are postponed, some repeatedly, there's so much weariness and exhaustion, and the event barely resembles what we had imagined or dreamed of. I know that most of my work over the past year and a half was dealing with families who had either had to postpone their b'nai mitzvah, had to have them in backyards without family and friends, rescheduled weddings, funerals, and memorials, often heartbreakingly without the support of loved ones present. The list of disappointments is so long. And for so many, it continues. It's not over. So on these high holy days, what does our tradition have to share with us about dealing with the kind of potentially spirit-crushing disappointment? What do we do with our hopes that haven't been realized? I think first and foremost, we are people who know something about resiliency. Our Torah text is filled with stories of resiliency. Resiliency is about the ability to reinvent oneself. And as a people, we have done this over and over again. It is in our DNA. We simply need to remember. We need to recall, to retell, to relive, and in this way, renew our lives. Jewish history is a recurring cycle of crisis and renewal. We were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Who survives that? We did. And we tell the story every year on Passover to remind ourselves of our resiliency. Our first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. Our people were taken into exile in Babylonia. We gained the admiration of that empire and the Persian Empire that followed it. We were given permission to return to our homeland, to rebuild the temple, and to rebirth ourselves. After Rome destroyed the temple in 70 of the Common Era, our people rebelled and were exiled once again. In response, a small group of spiritual luminaries gathered and reinvented Judaism. They taught us that God no longer wanted animal sacrifice, but instead opened the door to connection to the divine through prayer, through just and compassionate behavior, and acts of loving kindness. For us here, it seems simple and obvious. It was a radical reinvention. Rabbinic Judaism became the norm and sustained our people for centuries. However, by the 18th century, the Jewish operating system was breaking down. The pressure from the pogroms was growing unbearable. Then, in the darkest hour, a spiritual luminary arose named Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer, who became known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the great name. He went from village to village, doing spiritual first aid, teaching that while studying the academy was one way to connect to the God, one could plug into the radiance of Jewish spirituality through singing, through dancing, through joy and delight. Our people embraced this teaching, and we were again renewed. Now, the Enlightenment helped break down the walls of our forced ghettos, and our people embraced new opportunities. We rose to prominence in a most vibrant expression of resilience. Revolutionary thinkers like Spinoza, Marx, Freud, Durkheim, Einstein, Schoenberg burst onto the world stage and brought much needed and irrevocable change and growth. In this environment of change, Reform Judaism was born, an unimaginable development for traditional observant Jews. In 1933, Europe had a vibrant, established, and diverse Jewish community. And by 1945, 2/3 of European Jews had been murdered by the Nazis during World War II. 2/3. Out of this darkest night of the Jewish soul, the center of Jewish life was transplanted to the United States, and the state of Israel was born. As Rabbi Deborah Waxman writes, from trauma, we have had to heal. We have had to recover and revision, regenerate, and reseed vital Jewish life. We have found ways to cultivate resilience, both individually and collectively. Our resiliency has been tied to the quality of hope that our people have refined over the generations. One of the best insights into understanding the power of hope that I know comes from Václav Havel, the Czech playwright and dissident who helped shepherd his country out of communist tyranny in the 1990s and served as the first president in the new era. Havel wrote, "Hope is not the same as joy that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously heading towards success. No. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism." Havel says, "We don't talk about hope when the outcome is assumed, or assured rather. You don't have to hope that the sun will rise in the east in the morning. Hope is for when you're not sure what will be, or you think the odds are against you." End quote. There is defiant hope. There is angry hope. There is a hope based on the conviction that humanity and our planet is worth being sustained. Positive emotional energy isn't required to start hoping. The hope itself creates joy. I have learned from Rabbi John Spira Savitt that two researchers at Emory University, Marshall Duke and Robin Feivush, found out something about teenagers who know the stories of their families and their ancestors. They gave these teens a standard psychological test and then asked the teens 20 questions like, do you know where your mom and dad and grandparents went to high school? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know about an illness or something really terrible that happened in your family? Do you know the story of your own birth? Interestingly, these are some of the questions I asked the B'nai Mitzvah students I work with. But in the Emory study, the kids who knew more about these things tended to be more resilient. Did you get that? Especially if they knew these facts as a story with hopes and obstacles and how their parents or grandparents responded. So many of us have family stories of resilience. These are the stories we need right now. I would love for us to compile some of these stories in a Beth Chaim archive on our website, our own stories of resiliency. Wouldn't that be amazing? It'd be a blessing to jot down these stories and enrich our congregational historical memory. That they would be available to our children now would be a gift beyond measure. During the past year, I've had a chance to speak with so many people in our community. Several asked me, what do I do with the brokenness I am feeling? It occurred to me that there is another sacred cultural tradition that can shed some light on this and perhaps help us more meaningfully respond to this question that so many of us are bringing into these high holy days. This tradition comes from Japan and involves an ancient Japanese method of repairing broken porcelain that uses gold to fill in the cracks. Now, in our own culture, cracks in something as delicate as porcelain would destroy the integrity of the vase or whatever the container was. The crack would be a flaw that was unsightly and render the porcelain broken and no longer of value. But in Japanese culture, this method of restoring breakage with gold is called kintsugi and translate as golden joinery. Kintsugi is an outgrowth of the Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi, which honors the beauty of imperfections. The kintsugi artisan uses gold or other precious metal mixed with epoxy to repair the broken piece. This method emphasizes rather than hides the breakage. The repaired piece is often considered even more valuable than the original. Kintsugi embraces the breakage as part of the object's history, instead of something unacceptable to be hidden or thrown away. This is the opposite of what most of us were taught. In subtle and not so subtle ways, I learned that my imperfections were an embarrassment to be hidden, and so I could only conclude that I was supposed to be perfect and that I must hide my imperfections. This belief is embedded in our culture. If something's broken, toss it out. If something's flawed, hide it. Kintsugi is the perfect metaphor for the healing that is at the very heart of these high holy days. So many of us have had our lives broken apart and perhaps, in a few places, shattered beyond recognition. I think the greatest gift of kintsugi is that it quietly, gently invites us to look back and realize that for many of us, our greatest wish was to be unbroken instead of who we really are. That wish, implanted within us by often well-meaning loved ones and friends, causes so much suffering because it's impossible. Many of you have heard me say that the Hebrew word for sin, chet, is not ontological. It is not a part of our being. Instead, it's a term from archery that means missing the mark. We can take careful aim at it and we can miss the mark. Teshuvah means returning, trying again, exploring how we can get closer to our highest aims, draw closer, do essential course correction in line with our highest selves. These high holy days encourage us, invite us to show our broken edges to others, in counseling, to our family, dear friends, and other safe places where we can trust that we can receive acceptance, be loved and respected just for who we are. In this way, our broken parts can be transformed into what students of kintsugi call precious scars, which honor the wholeness of our lives, leaving nothing out. Of course, this philosophy, just like our high holy days, doesn't imply that there's an easy fix to things, to the enduring changes of living a life of meaning. Kintsugi takes masterful skill and care required to do this complex restoration. These high holy days ask us to no longer think of our broken parts as wounds. They're part of our history and who we have become. As an ancient kintsugi quote says, "The true life of the bowl began the moment it was dropped." One of my revered teachers, Dr. Rachel Remen, founder of Commonweal Cancer Help Center on the Peninsula, and the best-selling author of Kitchen Table Wisdom, tells a story in her book about meeting Dr. Carl Rogers, the famous humanistic psychologist. When she was a young doctor, she saw him demonstrate his method, which he called unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. A colleague of hers volunteered, and he was the patient, and got up on the stage with Dr. Rogers. Before he began his demonstration, Dr. Rogers paused a moment, looked at the audience, and said this: "Before every session, I take a moment to remember my humanity. There is no experience that this person has, I'm about to see, that I cannot share with this person, because I too am human. No matter how deep the wound, this person does not need to be ashamed in front of me. I too am vulnerable. And because of this, I am enough. I am enough." Whatever his story, he no longer needs to be alone with it. This is what will allow his healing to begin. End quote. This year, may we help each other to feel that we are enough, that we will get through this and come out the other side more whole. Yehi Ratzon, so may it be.